Hello, FedPhoenix fam. So, I'm going to make a video real briefly on federal halfway houses. A lot of people have been asking me about them, and that's been a pretty common topic in a lot of different social media forums and Facebook groups I'm in. So, I just wanted to touch on that. A lot of stuff that I'm going to make videos on over the next few days. Halfway houses, assaults at federal prison camps, blue collar versus white collar inmates, that kind of thing. I kind of touch on these things a little bit in various other videos, but of course I can never remember which videos I do this in. And on top of that, I don't think anybody wants to watch a whole video on something to hear, a 4 or 5 minute, part of it, you know what I mean? To address whatever it is that they have questions about. So let's get into it. I know it looks like I'm smoking in my house. I'm not. I don't smoke in my house. This is my screen door. I smoke out the screen door sometimes when it's particularly cold and stuff. So anyway. So first off, there's a lot of confusion right now about halfway houses in home confinement even. And this is because when I first went into prison, they had just started doing like CARES Act and stuff. And in general, if you had a home to go to and it could be, was suitable to be approved by the federal probation and a halfway house, you wouldn't go to halfway house. You would do home confinement. We didn't say, when I went in, I got my comp sheet, people didn't use the term halfway house, like, oh, I got to do X many, months in prison, then I have so many months of halfway house, like they normally did pre-COVID. And now it was, oh, I got so many months to do in prison and then so many months of home confinement. The only people that actually were going and being kept in the halfway houses were those that were otherwise homeless or didn't have a home that could be approved by the federal probation department and the halfway house. Because you got to remember, when you're on home confinement, you're not dealing with your PO. You're dealing with the halfway house. You're still an inmate. When you're in prison, you're an inmate. When you're in the halfway house, you're an inmate. When you're in home confinement, if you're on home confinement, you are an inmate. Until you are no longer an inmate, your PO does not deal with you. So keep that in mind as well, because there's a lot of confusion around that as well. However, because once you're no longer an inmate, you're kind of being handed off to the custody of federal probation. Federal probation also does a home check on wherever you're being released to, wherever you're doing your, if you're going to home confinement, they want to see it too. Usually before you even go to the halfway house, federal probation is already, if you have a home plan, a house you plan to go to, a residence, after halfway house, a lot of times federal probation already wants to have looked at it and approved it to avoid any issue where you've maxed out your time as an inmate, right? But then you don't actually have a suitable place to go. And now the PO has to figure out, does he try to get you into a rehab program? Does he try to get you into a homeless shelter? The feds don't like dealing with all that mess. So they like to, know where the heck you're going to be. They don't want to get down to the wire and not know where you're going to be, but where you're actually going to be at. And they definitely take their time about doing things in general as well. So, but with that, so your halfway house time, which is commonly referred to by people that are educating themselves via Google as Second Chance Act. And I've had a lot of people, when I'm doing their calculations or loved ones calculations, go, oh, don't forget to factor in the Second Chance Act. That's what I'm talking about when I say halfway house. Because that's, everyone gets that. It's not, you're not special if you get it. You're a federal inmate if you get it. And how that works is you get 54 days per year, which we just round up to 2 months when we do a rough calculation to get a ballpark time frame. You can do the exact 54 days per year, and that would require you knowing exactly how many days is in every month, every year that you're going to potentially be incarcerated. And it's a lot more complex. So, a lot of times, when I do calculations for people, unless they want day-for-day calculations, in which I would actually need to know some information off the comp sheet, like how many days of halfway house were actually given, not what should have been, but what actually was. And it's just a lot, and it's a much more drawn out, more complex process. And honestly, doing the rough calculations, the time frame you're going to get is going to be within a 30-day time frame of when you can expect to go home. And once you get into prison and you start getting comp sheets, this will become very much more specific over time. So anyway, but halfway houses, Some people opt out of halfway house, right? First off, you cannot get in trouble. You cannot be punished for deciding that you do not want to do halfway house time. You just want to max out your prison sentence. And for people with shorter sentences, this is often a good idea sometimes. And you may be wondering, well, why would anyone choose to be in prison versus being in a halfway house? At least in a halfway house, you have a little more freedom. You have a little more access to your family. You know, why would you not want that? And I'm going to tell you, before I went to prison, I researched the nearest federal halfway house to where I live that accepts women. And in doing this research, I discovered a lawsuit that, where a guy had been sent there because it's co-ed, and he was working and doing everything he was supposed to do, you know, whatever. And there was an issue with the buses. He was relying on public transportation to get to work and back to the halfway house. And there was an issue due to weather with the buses. And this issue was going to cause him to be like 15, 20 minutes late. So he calls the halfway house. He gives them a heads up. Hey, I'm going to be late. This is why. You can call the bus people and confirm if you need to, you know, whatever. He thought he was in the good. He gets to the halfway house. They have the cops waiting for him. They filed an escape charge on him for being late. And they said, we don't care to hear what your reasoning is, and we certainly aren't going to take time to verify anything. You weren't here when you were supposed to be here, so therefore, you know, you violated our rules, and so now you get to go to regional jail, which in West Virginia we have regionals, which are multi-county complexes. But now you go to regional jail, and, you know, until we figure out, you know, what your judge wants to do with this. So the guy gets hauled off to jail. And his family, thankfully, lucky for him, he has a family that had money and was involved. But his family contacts the halfway house while he's in jail, where they're waiting to see what's going to happen with this escape charge now. And his family says, okay, well, we want to come get his belongings because, you know, we've spent thousands of dollars between his very nice cell phone and his little bit of jewelry, his very nice clothes, you know, whatever. We want to come get his possessions. You know, since he may not be coming back there, and he certainly isn't there right now, we don't want anyone stealing them. And the halfway house basically said, like, we don't know what happened to his stuff. So then some of the family members show up at the halfway house, unannounced, demanding his belongings. And at this point, they observe that several of the staff and some of the residents were wearing his clothes, wearing his shoes, wearing his jewelry. And it was in the police report that when he was arrested at the halfway house insisted that the police empty his pockets, cell phone, wallet, all that, and leave all that in their possession, not take that with him when he gets processed into jail. So the family, with this information, then proceeded to file a lawsuit because they wanted to recoup the money that they had spent, right, on all this stuff. Well, when they filed a lawsuit against the halfway house, or they were in the process of doing that, their lawyer reached out to the halfway house and said, by the way, this is what's coming down the pipe. You know, did you just send this guy to jail to steal his shit? Like, you know what I mean? Like, what? This is insane that this is going down the way that it's going down. Everything from him being arrested to his stuff being missing and suddenly in the possession of a whole bunch of staff and some residents, you know. So once the halfway house found out that there was a lawsuit, you know, being made active against them for their obviously gross mishandling of things, the halfway house then privately, you know, with the lawyer, came to the agreement that they would drop the escape charge, right, if the lawsuit was dropped. So now he's not looking at doing additional prison time on a new charge. But they also got a hold of the RRM, which is kind of the middleman between prison and halfway house, the person who kind of, you know, communicates between the two entities, you know, before you go to the halfway house and if you have to go back to prison from the halfway house. And told the RRM that he was no longer, you know, they refused to house him at their halfway house, so he had to be moved to a different one. So when I read this story, I thought to myself, this is probably not an environment where I'm going to do well, or I'm even going to potentially be able to not get in some type of trouble, just by default, wrong place, wrong time, you know, upsetting somebody, whatever. And then I also, in my research, got a hold of a few people and read some online reviews of the halfway house, and I got a hold of a few people that had been there, and it was very apparent that the place is just riddled with drug use from the staff and the residents. And a lot of the staff were having relations with the residents as well. And so for a person like me who has no interest in being intimately involved with a staff member, or anybody for that matter, and I'm a person who doesn't do drugs, I could easily become a target as someone who is perceived as, oh, she thinks she's better than, or, oh, we got to worry about her telling, because she's not actually, whatever. And I was really, when I went into prison, I was really debating, like, on a 2-year sentence, that's like 2.5 months halfway house, or back then they said home confinement. Before I left prison, it had changed where it started changing, where now your paperwork would say this is your halfway house date instead of your home confinement. That was a very short snippet of time it did that. But I was definitely thinking like 2.5 extra months in prison versus 2.5 months in this halfway house. That could very much be a trap for me to catch an additional charge or go back to prison or whatever. It's probably in my best interest to just go ahead and say no thank you to halfway house time, and just do the time that I would have been allotted for halfway house. Just go ahead and do that in prison. Now if you're on a much bigger sentence, you know what I mean, or if you have a lot of halfway house time between RDAP and FSA and what you were given up front, if you have a big chunk of halfway house time, I could see where it's a lot more appealing to just kind of roll the dice with the halfway house than stay in prison. But there are certainly a lot of people, I've seen some people say they refused halfway house because they were recovering drug addicts. And it's well known that most of these halfway houses are just crawling with drug use. And they felt like in that environment, they would not be able to stay off drugs. And so to protect their sobriety, they stayed in prison for what would have been their halfway house time. Now, mind you, you're not giving up good time by doing this. You can't be punished for doing this. Now, you do need to let your case manager, caseworker, all them people know at least a few months in advance if you plan to opt out of halfway house. But, and I think you have to have signed paperwork and stuff for that too. But yeah. So another thing with halfway houses is a lot of people are like, oh, my loved one got 3 years in prison and they're going to get, X many months halfway house and so many months home confinement. That's not how it works. Look at anybody's comp sheet. Yes, the comp sheets from the height of COVID, because I had them, did say in place of halfway house, they just said home confinement. This is when you leave prison. This is when you go start your home confinement. They don't say that anymore. And so now, mind you, some people are kind of grandfathered in. That does happen. But what I've been seeing happen to multiple people is they were under the impression that they were going to go from prison to home confinement, which of course with home confinement, you would go from prison to the halfway house. That's who's supervising your home confinement. Get your ankle monitor, do all your intake processing. And this could take anywhere from a couple hours to a couple of days. And then you would, of course, go home to do your, to be doing halfway house time on home confinement, supervised by the halfway house. But some of these people that are kind of grandfathered in, their paperwork is still saying, that instead of halfway house time, it's saying home confinement time. And so they get out and they go to the halfway house and they're like, okay, I'm here, ready to do my paperwork, get my ankle monitor on and get the heck up out of here and go home. And the halfway houses are like, you're not going home. Absolutely not. We have bed space for you. You're staying here. And that's just their reality. Because here's the thing is whether you're on home confinement or whether you're physically in the halfway house, you are supervised by the halfway house. So it is completely at their discretion at any time to put you on home confinement or to bring you back into the halfway house from home confinement. Completely at their discretion. And that includes even at the very beginning. If you thought you had 6 months or 9 months of home confinement after prison, you go to the halfway house and they go, psych, you're doing it here. You're doing it there. And you really have no recourse because you're still an inmate. And so as an inmate, unfortunately, you're not you can't expect for things to be fair or things to be nice or go the way they should or even be done in a timely fashion because that's just not realistic. Another thing I want to say about halfway houses is you have the Bureau of Prisons, right, who actually is over the halfway houses, just like the prisons. And they have their rules and criteria and whatever. And then you have prisons and they have their, the BOP rules plus the institutional rules. Then you have halfway houses that are under BOP rules, right? And then they have their own individual rules and policies and procedures and whatever, which they may or may not follow properly. And if they don't follow them properly, you still have little to no recourse. But so if you're going to a halfway house in Florida, Tampa, and I'm going to a halfway house in Austin, Texas, we can expect to have very different experiences, quite possibly. We can expect that the program of the halfway houses we're at are not going to be the same, may not even be terribly similar. One thing that is going to be similar across the board with halfway houses is, with the halfway house, they usually have a level or a tier program, right? So after you've been there for so long and you've met certain parameters, you've obtained employment, kept employment for a certain period of time, did whatever programming they wanted you to do. Because in the halfway house, and just like on home confinement, programming isn't about like in prison where you voluntarily take programming if you choose. It's if they tell you this is the program we want you to do, you do it. I mean, there is no, I'd rather not. No, that they're not going to be listening to any of that. But usually in these level programs and halfway houses, you're going to have a certain point where you've been there for a certain period of time and you've reached certain parameters that you can then be kind of graduated out to finish the remainder of your halfway house time on home confinement. And at most halfway houses, this could be as early as a few months. This could be as long as 6-7 months. Generally, it's kind of in the middle, 4 or 5 months at the halfway house. So if you have 10 months of halfway house, you can expect to do, let's say 5-6 months in the halfway house and possibly do the rest on home confinement, supervised by the halfway house. So, there's that. A lot of people have asked me, I'm picking my loved one up from prison. They're getting released. What can they have, with them to go into halfway house? It's generally kind of similar, but it varies greatly. So I always tell people, if you were in prison or your loved one is in prison, at least a couple months before you expect to go to halfway house or get released, or get released to the halfway house, you definitely want to email the reentry person at your prison and say, hey, I'm going to this halfway house. I want to get familiar with their rules and their procedures. Can you please, send me a copy of the handbook? And they typically will oblige that. Granted, it may take a week or so, but you'll get it at mail call. And then you can begin to familiarize yourself with at what point in your halfway house stay is it realistic that you would be transferring to home confinement? And how realistic is that? And are these rules and stuff, how, where can you foresee your difficulties and how are you going to get around them? Yeah. So that's kind of the rundown. A lot of people will say, well, there's a lot of discrepancy between when the case manager told my loved one that they would be going to halfway house and they put in for this date with the RRM, which again is kind of the middleman between the prison and the halfway house. They put in this date with the RRM, but we haven't heard anything and it looks like that's not going to be right. And again, if you do not serve your entire original sentence day for day, legally, they've done nothing wrong. Whether you're in prison, whether you're in the halfway house, whether you're in home confinement, wherever you are, they have not done anything wrong. If you have not, and chances are when you go to the halfway house or home confinement, you have not exceeded the day-for-day maximum of your sentence. Matter of fact, I know you haven't. So, because that's just not how that works. That's one of the few boundaries that they can't cross. So, so there's going to be, a lot of times there is a lot of last-minute floof. Dates getting pushed back and getting changed. Or the halfway house may say, well, this person is supposed to come on the 15th, but we'll have an open bed on the 7th. And, there are other people that could come, but if this person can come on the 7th, then we'll take them. If not, we're not going to have another open bed for another month. So they're going to have to stay in prison an additional, few weeks. Sometimes at that point, the RRM will get back a hold of the prison and say, these are the options. Either this person can go a little early to the halfway house or they're going to be going significantly late. And depending on who your case manager is, what kind of mood they're in, what kind of person they are, what kind of person they think you are, will probably decide whether they end up telling you, hey, good news, you're going to the halfway house a few days early. Or if they say, sorry, there was an issue with beds at the halfway house, your date's getting pushed back a few weeks. You know what I mean? And again, this is a situation in which you are powerless. So to be upset about it and really, if you find yourself in that situation or your loved one's in that situation, you really need to just think about the fact that a few more weeks, you've done what, months, years in prison? Take it on the chin. Just take it in stride, take it on the chin. And you got to think too, when it comes to deciding if you want to opt out of halfway house or not, which most people don't do. But if you're considering that, a lot of the times the rooms, they're either rooms with like multiple beds, or a lot of times it's like dorm style with bunk beds. And in that environment, if you're at work one day and there's a shakedown, right? And maybe somebody who smokes meth finds out the shakedown's coming because maybe they're doing something less than respectable with one of the employees who tips them off, and they only got minutes until the shakedown, and they got their meth pipe in their locker and a little shaky shake, they will probably throw it under a communal bunk bed, a communal table, something that where they can say, where they have what is legally called plausible deniability, where they can say, it's not mine, I don't know about it. And the thing is if that ends up under your bunk, you're at work, you're minding your business. The shakedown happens. If you're not arrested at work, you're going to be arrested when you get back to the prison, because you were in possession of drugs and drug paraphernalia, and you're quite possibly looking at an additional charge, as well as doing more of the charge you're dealing with now, as far as your time goes. So, and because these places are notoriously overrun with drug use, that kind of risk, a lot of people are just like, no stinking way. And then too, like, a lot of my clients are campers or people that go to Lowe's. And so when you're in those facilities, you are with people whose, pattern of violence is minimal to none. You're with people who have, shorter sentences, have a lot more to lose. The culture is very different than higher security facilities, right? So, but when you're in a halfway house, you're mixed in with everybody. There is no separation by security level. So in your dorm, you may have a couple campers, a couple Lowe's. You may have a dozen other people who just came from a maximum security, who have been living for years watching and partaking in frequent assaults and stabbings, and they've seen people die while they're in prison from assaults, and this is something that they've just become desensitized to. So, the day that they think you have an attitude with them, whether you do or don't, they may or may not stab you in your neck, just as a reflex, because this is the environment and the culture they've lived in for an extended period of time. And that's another risk of going to the halfway house. Another risk is people get extorted. In camp, people will try to extort you with lies and sympathy scams and BS and drama and maybe a little intimidation here and there. But at the end of the day, if you stand your ground, you're not gonna be, no one's gonna really bother to put much effort into that. Again, at a halfway house, you have people from mediums, you have people from high securities, you have people who may have spent the last, 10 years surviving off the fact that they can intimidate or harm people into giving them what they want. And if they decide that you're a person who has a little better resources than them, you may be a target. And I'm not saying all this to like scare people off of halfway house. Most people that I have seen that have went to halfway house, they have not got new charges. They have not got sent back to prison in the process. The ones who do are usually the people who are actually doing the crap, who are doing dope, or who are trying to sell dope in the place, or who are trying to argue with the staff, or fight with other residents. Because at that point you're labeled resident, not inmate, even though technically you're still an inmate. Usually, if you mind your own business and you stay to yourself and you don't get involved in the crap, you can complete your halfway house time fairly efficiently, unscathed. But I'm just saying that you should be aware of the realities that you are volunteering yourself into. And many halfway houses, particularly those in inner cities, are usually in the worst of the worst neighborhoods. And so that comes, if you're a person that's not comfortable in that environment or is not familiar with how to kind of function in that environment, this could become an issue for you as well. So it's just something to think about, but with the halfway house time, you will get 6 months halfway house time, on your initial comp sheet, or 10% of your sentence, whichever is less. You can certainly have your loved ones, if you're not already aware, have your loved ones Google the nearest halfway house for your gender that's federal, and start doing some research online about it, kind of what's going on there and how bad it is or isn't. Another thing too, when you're in the halfway house, you're still an inmate. You're still property of the Bureau of Prisons. So even though there may be a federal halfway house, gender specific for you, because it doesn't matter your security level at that point. But 10 miles from your house and 5 miles from Nana's. If that place does not have any beds and they aren't expecting to have any beds for like an extended period of time, then you may be sent to a halfway house 200 miles away, 100 miles away, anything like that. And you probably won't know until the very last minute. And again, this is just the crap that you can expect as a person going through the Federal Bureau of Prisons system. And I try to be careful to not sugarcoat things. I don't want to, scare people or make them nervous or any of that. Not at all. But I would rather you go to the halfway house having more reservations than you need to have than you get to the halfway house and you're thinking that things are sweeter than what they are. And then I see your wife or your husband on Facebook selling t-shirts to pay for your funeral. And again, a lot of people don't get killed in halfway houses. Generally, if you die at a halfway house, it's either a self-induced drug overdose or you were outside of the halfway house in the community and something happened, whether it was random or personal. But yeah, these are just some things to think about. And some people will say, well, I got a recommendation for the judge for this prison, which we all know that counts for literally nothing. And they'll say, well, I also got a recommendation for this halfway house. Or I know my case manager wants me to go to this halfway house. They have some say in it, but then it goes to the RRM. And then the RRM figures out all the logistics of the situation. And if the logistics are not conducive for it to be easy for them to put you in whatever halfway house that you think or you want to go to or your case manager is suggesting, that's not where you're going. So will you be in the nearest one to your home for your gender? Probably. Can you bet money on that? Not at all. So just some food for thought. And like I said, I've seen a lot of people that's very alarming to me lately whose paperwork, and they've showed me, because I'm like, there's no way they didn't, revert your paperwork back to saying halfway house instead of home confinement. They're like, no, really, my stuff still says this. And I, this is fully what me and my family thought and what we were told. And they've showed receipts, they've showed paperwork. And I've had to say, you know what? Wow. I mean, just wow. But there have been many people that thought they were going on home confinement. They were going to go to the halfway house, get their ankle monitor, do their orientation crap, and be, serving their halfway house time, primarily at home. And they get there, and it's like, nope, psych, you're staying here now. This has happened to several people. Lately, it seems to really kind of be a trend. So just be wary, or not wary, but just be aware that if you think you're going to just get on home confinement at the halfway house and they're just going to send you on home, that may not actually play out that way. And there's really no way to predict that until you're actually in the moment and they just do whatever they want to do. Yeah, there was something else I wanted to say and I can't recall, of course. And if you're on home confinement, it isn't like the halfway house is like, oh, you can't drink alcohol, you can't whatever, you got to stay within the home. Oh no, they're going to expect you, it's going to be way more intense than that. They're going to expect you to work outside the home, a job that they approved on hours they approved, and your ankle monitor is going to tell them your exact route there, your exact route back, if you stopped anywhere longer than you should have. Some halfway houses are really lenient about this stuff. Some are very strict. Some halfway houses want you to come in once a week, be searched, take a drug test, maybe participate in some kind of programming. If you have a vehicle, have that searched as well. Some of them, and I've known a few people that have went to them and dealt with this, some of the halfway houses will literally be calling you any time of the day or night. You have to answer the phone and they say, come in, and you have to get there when what they consider a reasonable time frame. So you may live an hour from the halfway house, and if it's one that likes to call people at random times, you may have just got off work, you're super tired. They call and say, okay, well, we don't care that you just got off work. Get on the highway and get here. You have 45 minutes or you have an hour to be here, or you're breaking rules. You're out of bounds. You're out of bounds, which could very easily result, obviously, in an escape charge. You just have to do it. There is no, and one of the conditions of being on home confinement, whether you go straight to home confinement, after you get orientated at the halfway house or whether you earn it from the halfway house, is you have to sign a paper saying that you are guaranteeing that you have reliable transportation 24/7 to get wherever they tell you to go. So you can't say, oh, my aunt has my car. I can't make it right now. Out of bounds. Oh, my battery died, out of bounds. Okay, great. We'll send the marshals to come get you. Enjoy your time in jail. I mean, and that's really the level of indifference. And right now, because there's such a shortage of halfway house beds to meet the need, because again, the FSA thing is kind of new too, and this is causing more people to go to halfway houses much quicker than they normally would, or somewhat quicker at least. It's really, they're going to be really quick to not give a second thought to hitting you with an out of bounds and letting the RRM sort it out. And that's not something you want at all. So, you really have to really weigh your options and make an educated decision to the best of your ability. And if you have a loved one in the halfway house, not only can they, going to a halfway house, you know what I mean? But not only can the person before they go to the halfway house as an inmate get a copy of the handbook and get familiar with it, right? Because once you get there and they hand you the handbook and you sign the paper saying you got it, literally from that minute forward, no one cares what you do or do not know. If you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, or you're doing something you're not supposed to be doing, there will be consequences most likely. But another thing is, if you're the spouse or the best friend or the whatever of someone who's coming to a halfway house, you can usually go online and literally, it's usually like a PDF, and look at the halfway house's handbook. So you can familiarize yourself with it too. So now it's not just the person who's going through this crazy adjustment of prison to halfway house that has to absorb all this information and know all these things. But now they have you, the person that they trust, the person that they talk to, who also knows a good bit, that can say, hey, wait a minute, no, that's not right. Or, hey, remember, you have to do this, And I think it really creates like a safety net to make it more plausible for a person to successfully complete the halfway house. So anyway, I'm going to end this now because it's got long. But good day, God bless, and I'll holler at you later. Oh, my Cash App and PayPal are in the description if you'd like to donate to the channel, as is a link to my merch line, as is my email if you need to get a hold of me for any reason. And as you know, I'm working on my first book. And if you have not subscribed, please do. It costs you absolutely nothing. It does me a world of favors. I really would appreciate it. So anyway, now I think we're done. Good day. God bless.